The ledger lay open on the mahogany desk, 47 names inscribed in careful copperplate beneath the heading "Property of the Whitmore Estate, Charleston District, South Carolina, October 1859. Catherine Whitmore's hand trembled as her finger traced down the inventory her husband had maintained with such meticulous pride, each entry accompanied by an estimated market value, age, and specialized skill. Field hands valued at $800, house servants at $1,200, skilled craftsmen, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the cooper, appraised at $1,500 each. And at the bottom of the page, in ink darker than the rest, as though her husband had pressed harder when writing it, Joshua, 6 feet 9 inches, exceptional strength, dangerous, value $2,000, never to be sold separately or freed under any circumstances. Her husband had died 3 days earlier. His final words, a rasping warning delivered with a grip that left bruises on her wrist. Keep Joshua chained. He knows too much. He's seen too much. The others fear him, but you should fear him more. Promise me, Catherine, promise me you'll never let him go. She had promised, though she hadn't understood why Thomas Whitmore, a man who'd built his fortune on the labor of enslaved people and never shown a moment's hesitation in wielding absolute power over them, would spend his dying breath warning her about one man, one exceptionally tall, exceptionally quiet man who worked the forge and rarely spoke to anyone, enslaved or free. Now, sitting in the study that still smelled of her husband's tobacco and brandy, Catherine made a decision that would have seemed incomprehensible to anyone who knew the Whitmore family's history. She would free 46 of the 47 people her husband had claimed as property. She would keep only Joshua, not because she believed her husband's warning, but because she needed to understand what had terrified a man who'd never shown fear of anything in his life. Before we continue with what happened next, I need you to understand something about the world we're stepping into. If you're watching this because you want to know the real stories, the ones that don't make it into the textbooks, the ones about resistance and survival and the complicated truths about power and humanity, then subscribe to this channel right now. We're building a community of people who refuse to let these stories disappear. And when you're done watching, leave a comment with just one word. Remember, let's see how many of us are committed to making sure these histories stay alive. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because Catherine Whitmore's story doesn't start with her husband's death. It starts 23 years earlier, when she was Catherine Hendricks, the daughter of a Charleston shipping merchant who'd made his fortune in the coastal trade. Catherine had grown up in a world where enslaved people were as much a part of the landscape as the live oaks, draped with Spanish moss, where the sounds of the auction block on Chalmers Street were as familiar as church bells, where the entire economy of the city, the magnificent homes on the Battery, the theaters and hotels, the imported silks and French wines, rested on a foundation of human bondage so normalized that most white Charlestonians never questioned it at all. She'd been taught to manage a household, to direct servants with firm kindness, to maintain the social graces expected of a woman of her class. She'd been taught that enslaved people were inferior, childlike, incapable of the higher reasoning that distinguished the white race. She'd been taught these things the way she'd been taught to embroider and play the pianoforte as essential skills for a woman of her station. But Catherine had also been taught to read, and she'd developed an appetite for books that her father had encouraged, believing that an educated daughter would make a better match. She'd read philosophy and history, poetry and political theory. She'd read the abolitionist tracts that circulated secretly in Charleston, despite the city's best efforts to suppress them. Pamphlets that made arguments she couldn't easily dismiss, that planted questions in her mind about the system she'd been raised to accept without examination. She'd never spoken these questions aloud, To do so would have been social suicide in a city where even mild criticism of slavery could result in ostracism or worse. But they'd taken root nonetheless, growing quietly in the spaces between what she'd been taught and what she'd observed with her own eyes. When Thomas Whitmore had courted her in 1836, he'd seemed like everything a Charleston gentleman should be. 32 years old to her 18, educated at the College of Charleston, heir to a rice plantation that sprawled across 3,000 acres of the Low Country, he'd been charming and attentive, bringing her flowers and books, taking her to concerts and exhibitions. He'd never spoken crudely about the people he enslaved, never used the casual brutality of language that some planters employed. He'd presented himself as a paternalist, a benevolent master who provided for his people, who saw slavery as a civilizing institution that benefited both races. Catherine's father had approved the match enthusiastically. They'd married in June of 1837 in a ceremony at St. Michael's Church, attended by 300 guests. The first crack in the facade had come 3 months into the marriage, when Catherine had witnessed Thomas ordering an overseer to whip a field hand named Samuel for the crime of looking him directly in the eye. The whipping had been methodical, 20 lashes delivered with mechanical precision while Thomas watched without expression. When Catherine had protested later in the privacy of their bedroom, Thomas had explained patiently that discipline was necessary, that enslaved people understood only force, that mercy was actually cruelty because it encouraged disobedience that would ultimately require harsher punishment. "I'm protecting them from themselves," he'd said, and he'd seemed to believe it. Over the next 23 years, Catherine had learned to navigate the contradictions of her position. She'd learned to manage the household enslaved people with a combination of firmness and small kindnesses, extra food at Christmas, medicine when they were sick, permission to maintain their own garden plots. She'd learned to look away from the worst of what happened in the fields, to focus on the parts of plantation life she could influence, however marginally. She'd learned to live with the cognitive dissonance of knowing that the people who served her meals and dressed her hair and raised her children were human beings, with their own thoughts and feelings and desires, while simultaneously participating in a system that treated them as property. She'd learned to be complicit, in other words, in exchange for comfort and security and social standing. But she'd also learned things Thomas hadn't intended her to learn. She'd learned that the people he enslaved had their own complex social structures, their own systems of knowledge and resistance. She'd learned that the apparent docility many of them displayed was a survival strategy, a mask worn to avoid punishment. She'd learned that information flowed through the enslaved community with remarkable speed and accuracy, news of escapes, of rebellions in other states, of the growing sectional crisis that was pulling the nation toward war. She'd learned to listen to the conversations that happened in the kitchen and the laundry, the fragments of truth that revealed themselves when white people weren't paying attention. And she'd learned about Joshua. Thomas had purchased Joshua in 1842 from an estate sale in Virginia, paying the extraordinary sum of $2,000 for a 16-year-old boy whose only apparent qualification was his unusual height and strength. Catherine had been curious about the purchase. Thomas was normally a shrewd businessman who never overpaid for anything, but when she'd asked about it, he'd simply said that Joshua would be valuable for heavy labor. He'd put Joshua to work in the forge, learning blacksmithing from an older enslaved craftsman named Abel, and for the first few years that had seemed to be the extent of it. Joshua had grown to his full height of 6 feet 9 inches, had developed the massive shoulders and arms of a man who worked with hammer and anvil, had learned to make everything from horseshoes to decorative ironwork. He'd been quiet, solitary, speaking only when necessary, keeping his eyes down in the presence of white people. But Thomas had watched Joshua with an intensity that Catherine had found unsettling. He'd forbidden Joshua from learning to read, though he'd allowed other skilled enslaved people that privilege. He'd kept Joshua separate from the other enslaved men, housing him in a small building near the forge rather than in the quarters. He'd never hired Joshua out to other planters, though blacksmiths could command premium rates and the income would have been substantial. And he'd made it clear to the overseers that Joshua was never to be punished physically, no matter what he did, an exemption that was unprecedented and that had caused resentment among both the white overseers and some of the other enslaved people. Catherine had asked Thomas about this special treatment once in 1848, after Joshua had been seen talking to a group of field hands in a way that had made the overseer nervous. Thomas had been drinking that night, and he'd said more than he'd intended. Joshua's father was a dangerous man, he'd said, led an uprising in Southampton County before Nat Turner made it famous, killed 3 overseers and a plantation owner before they caught him. They hanged him, but not before he'd planted ideas in a lot of heads. Joshua was just a baby then, but the people who knew his father say he has the same look in his eyes, the same intelligence. I bought him because I wanted to control him, to keep him where I could watch him. Better to have him under my roof than plotting somewhere I can't see. It was the only time Thomas had ever admitted that he was afraid of one of the people he enslaved, and he'd never spoken of it again. But Catherine had remembered, and she'd started watching Joshua herself, trying to understand what Thomas had seen in him. What she'd observed was a man of extraordinary self-control, who endured the daily humiliations of enslavement without visible reaction, who worked with focused intensity, who seemed to exist in a state of constant, patient waiting. She'd seen him reading once. He'd somehow learned, despite Thomas's prohibition, sitting in the forge late at night with a book he'd hidden in the coal bin. She'd said nothing, and he'd known she'd seen him, and a silent understanding had passed between them. Now, with Thomas dead and the plantation hers to manage, Catherine sat in the study and made her calculations. The estate was worth approximately $140,000. The land, the buildings, the equipment, and the 47 human beings her husband had claimed as property. Under South Carolina law, she had absolute control over all of it. She could sell everything and move north. She could maintain the plantation as it was, hiring an overseer to manage the enslaved labor force. She could free everyone and face the social and legal consequences of that decision. Or she could do something more complicated, something that would require her to finally act on the questions that had been growing in her mind for 23 years. She called for Joshua the next morning. He came to the study still wearing his leather apron, smelling of coal smoke and hot metal, his head nearly touching the door frame as he entered. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his expression neutral, waiting for her to speak. Catherine gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Joshua." He hesitated. Enslaved people didn't sit in the presence of white people, but after a moment he lowered himself into the chair, his knees nearly level with his chest, because the furniture wasn't built for someone his size. Catherine slid the ledger across the desk so he could see it. "I'm going to free everyone on this list except you," she said. "I'm going to give them manumission papers, money for travel, and letters of introduction to contacts I have in Philadelphia and New York. I'm going to help them get north before anyone in Charleston realizes what I've done. But I need your help to do it, and I need to understand something first. My husband spent 23 years watching you like you were a loaded gun. He died warning me about you. I need to know why." Joshua was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face as though trying to determine whether this was a trap. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured, the voice of a man who'd learned to choose his words with extreme care. "Your husband knew what I was," he said. "He knew I'd never accepted being enslaved. He knew I was waiting for the right moment. He knew I was dangerous because I could think and I could plan and I could wait as long as necessary. He bought me to control me, but he could never control what I was thinking. He could chain my body, but he couldn't chain my mind. That's what terrified him. Catherine nodded slowly. And if I free you, what happens then? If you free me, I'll help you free the others, Joshua said. And then I'll go north and join the people who are fighting to end this system. I'll use everything I've learned here about how plantations work, about how enslaved people resist, about the weaknesses in the system to help others escape. Your husband was right to fear me, Mrs. Whitmore, but he was wrong about one thing. I'm not dangerous because I'm violent. I'm dangerous because I refuse to forget that I'm human. Catherine felt something shift inside her, a decision crystallizing that she'd been moving toward for years without fully acknowledging it. Then we have work to do, she said, and you need to start calling me Catherine. What happened next required planning that was both meticulous and rapid. Catherine had perhaps 2 weeks before. Thomas's relatives and business associates would start asking questions about the management of the estate, before the gossip networks of Charleston society would begin to notice that something unusual was happening at the Whitmore plantation. She needed to move 46 people out of South Carolina and into free states without attracting attention, without triggering the alarm systems that existed to prevent exactly this kind of mass escape. She needed to do it legally enough that she couldn't be prosecuted for slave stealing, a capital crime in South Carolina, but quickly enough that no one could stop her before it was done. Joshua became her partner in this planning, and Catherine discovered that Thomas had been right about one thing. Joshua's intelligence was formidable. He knew every person on the plantation, their skills, their family connections, their dreams of freedom. He knew the routes that escaping enslaved people used, the safe houses and sympathetic contacts along the Underground Railroad. He knew how to move people in small groups to avoid detection, how to forge travel documents, how to use the chaos of a port city to slip people onto northbound ships. He'd been planning escapes for years, Catherine realized, helping people get away 1 or 2 at a time, never enough to draw attention but enough to give hope to those who remained. Together they created a system. Catherine would manumit people in small groups, claiming she was hiring them out to businesses in Charleston, a common practice that wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. She'd provide them with free papers, money, and letters of introduction to abolitionist contacts in Philadelphia. Joshua would coordinate their actual movements, using his network of free black people and sympathetic whites to move them from Charleston to safe houses in North Carolina, then Virginia, then Pennsylvania. The whole operation would take 10 days if everything went perfectly, 2 weeks if they encountered complications. They started with the families, mothers and children first, then fathers who would follow once their families were safe. Catherine signed manumission papers in her study, while Joshua waited in the forge, ready to move people as soon as the documents were ready. The first group left on a Tuesday morning, 5 people who boarded a ship to Wilmington carrying papers that identified them as free black laborers hired by a textile mill. The second group left 2 days later, traveling overland with a Quaker merchant who'd agreed to transport them hidden in a wagon carrying furniture. The third group, the fourth, the fifth, each departure carefully timed, each route different, each group small enough to avoid attracting attention. Catherine spent those 10 days in a state of controlled terror, knowing that discovery would mean not just social ruin but criminal prosecution, that South Carolina law prescribed death for anyone who helped enslaved people escape. She forged her husband's signature on business documents to explain the movement of people off the plantation. She met with Thomas's attorney and claimed she was reorganizing the labor force to improve efficiency. She attended a tea at a neighbor's house and smiled and made small talk while her mind raced through contingency plans. She became someone she'd never been before, a criminal, a collaborator in resistance, a woman who'd finally chosen a side in the moral crisis that was tearing the nation apart. Joshua orchestrated the movements with precision that came from years of covert planning. He'd built relationships with free black people throughout Charleston, dock workers who could get people onto ships, laundresses who could hide travelers in their homes, ministers who could provide sanctuary in church basements. He'd memorized the schedules of the city guard, the patterns of the slave patrols, the times when the docks were most crowded and therefore easiest to disappear into. He'd created a communication system using seemingly innocent messages. A particular arrangement of tools in the forge meant a group was ready to move. A certain hymn sung in the evening meant the route was clear. A chalk mark on a specific fence post meant danger and delay. By the 8th day, 38 people had left the plantation. By the 10th day, 43. Catherine's hands shook as she signed the final manumission papers, knowing that she was approaching the moment when the deception would become impossible to maintain. Thomas's brother had sent a message saying he'd be visiting the plantation in 3 days to discuss the estate. The overseer had started asking questions about why so many people were being hired out simultaneously. A neighbor had commented that the quarters seemed unusually quiet. On the 11th day, Catherine freed the last 3 people, 2 elderly men who'd worked the rice fields for 40 years, and a young woman who'd been a house servant. She gave them money, papers, and directions to a safe house in Charleston, where Joshua's contacts would help them continue north. She watched them walk down the Oak Line Drive toward the road, carrying everything they owned in small bundles, free, for the first time in their lives. Then she returned to the study and sat across from Joshua, who'd remained behind as they'd agreed. 46 people, she said. 46 people who are free because you knew how to make it happen. My husband was right to fear you, Joshua. You're the most dangerous person I've ever met. Dangerous to a system built on the lie that some people are property. So now I need to know, why did you stay? I would have freed you first. You could have been in Philadelphia a week ago. Joshua leaned back in the chair, and for the first time since Catherine had known him, he smiled, an expression that transformed his face, that revealed the man he might have been if he'd been born free. I stayed because this wasn't finished, he said. I stayed because 46 people getting free is good, but it's not enough. I stayed because I need you to understand something, Catherine. Your husband didn't just enslave people. He kept records, detailed records of every crime committed on this plantation, every whipping, every sale that separated families, every woman who was raped by overseers, every child who was sold away from their mother. He documented it all in ledgers he kept locked in the safe in this room, because he was a meticulous man who believed he was building a legacy. He never imagined those records would be used against him, but that's exactly what I need them for. Catherine felt her blood turn cold. What are you talking about? Joshua stood and walked to the painting of Thomas that hung above the fireplace, a portrait commissioned 5 years earlier, showing him in his finest clothes, looking every inch the prosperous planter. He reached behind the frame and pulled out a key that had been taped to the back. Your husband showed me where he kept this once, years ago, when he was drunk and wanted to boast about his record-keeping. He thought I couldn't read, couldn't understand what the ledgers meant. But I could, and I did. I've been waiting for him to die so I could get access to these records without having to kill him for them. Now I need you to help me get them north, to the abolitionists who are building the case against slavery. These ledgers document 23 years of crimes. They name names: overseers, slave traders, judges who ruled in favor of masters, merchants who profited from the system. They're evidence, Catherine. They're proof that can be used in courts and newspapers and political campaigns. They're dangerous in a way that even I'm not, because they're written in your husband's own hand. Catherine watched as Joshua opened the safe and removed 4 leather-bound ledgers, each one thick with pages of meticulous entries. He opened one at random and showed her an entry from 1844. Purchased female, age 14, from Rutledge Estate. $900 assigned to house service. Breeding potential noted. Another entry from 1851. Sold male, age 8, to McPherson Plantation. $600. Mother became unmanageable after sale. Required correction. 30 lashes administered. Page after page of transactions that reduced human beings to livestock, of punishments detailed with clinical precision, of a system of violence and exploitation documented by a man who'd never imagined his records would be used to indict him. "This is what I am, Catherine," Joshua said quietly. "I'm not just a blacksmith. I'm a witness. I'm a keeper of records. I'm someone who remembers every name, every story, every crime. Your husband feared me because he knew that I was watching, that I was waiting, that someday there would be a reckoning. He just never imagined that reckoning would come through his own documentation. Now I need you to help me get these ledgers to William Lloyd Garrison in Boston. I need you to use your connections, your money, your privilege as a white woman to do something your husband never could have stopped, even if he'd lived. I need you to help me turn his legacy of enslavement into evidence for abolition." Catherine looked at the ledgers, then at Joshua, then back at the ledgers. She thought about the 46 people who were even now traveling toward freedom, about the system she'd been complicit in for 23 years, about the choice she was being offered. She could refuse, could burn the ledgers, could maintain her position in Charleston society by claiming she'd been deceived by a dangerous enslaved man. Or she could finish what she'd started, could use the last of her husband's money and influence to strike a blow against the system he'd profited from. "I'll do it," she said. "But not just the ledgers. I'm coming with you. I'm going to testify about what I witnessed, what I participated in, what I should have stopped years ago. I'm going to use my voice as a white Southern woman to tell the truth about slavery, because people will listen to me in ways they won't listen to you, and that's wrong, but it's useful. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to undo the harm I enabled. And I'm going to start by helping you get these records to people who can use them." Joshua studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we leave tonight. I have a contact who can get us on a ship to Baltimore. From there, we can travel overland to Philadelphia, then Boston. It'll be dangerous. You'll be traveling with an escaped slave, and if we're caught, you'll be prosecuted for theft of property. You'll lose everything, Catherine, your home, your social position, your safety. Are you sure?" Catherine thought about the question, about everything she was giving up and everything she might gain. She thought about the 46 people who were free because she'd finally chosen to act. She thought about the ledgers and the stories they contained, the names of people whose suffering had been documented but never acknowledged. She thought about her husband's dying warning and realized that he'd been right. Joshua was dangerous, but he was dangerous to a system that deserved to be destroyed, and she wanted to be dangerous too. "I'm sure," she said. They left that night, walking away from the plantation that had been built on enslaved labor, carrying 4 ledgers that documented 23 years of crimes. They traveled as a white widow and her hired servant, using Catherine's privilege to move through a world that would have stopped Joshua at every checkpoint. They reached Baltimore in 3 days, Philadelphia in 5, Boston in 7. Catherine delivered the ledgers to William Lloyd Garrison personally, sitting in his office while he read entry after entry, his face growing darker with each page. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "This is evidence we can use. This is a slaveholder's own documentation of the system's brutality. Mrs. Whitmore, you've done something remarkable." But Catherine knew it wasn't remarkable. It was simply what she should have done years earlier, what she'd been morally obligated to do from the moment she'd understood what slavery really was. She'd been complicit for 23 years, and no single act of resistance could erase that complicity. But she could spend the rest of her life trying to make amends, and that's what she did. She became a speaker for the abolitionist movement, traveling throughout the North to tell her story, to describe what she'd witnessed on a South Carolina plantation, to use her identity as a Southern white woman to challenge the lies that defenders of slavery told about the system's benevolence. She testified before state legislatures considering personal liberty laws. She wrote articles for abolitionist newspapers. She used her husband's money to fund Underground Railroad operations. She became, in other words, exactly the kind of dangerous woman that Thomas Whitmore had feared. Someone who refused to be silent, who refused to accept the system as inevitable, who used her privilege as a weapon against the institution that had granted her that privilege. Joshua went to work for the abolitionist movement in a different way. He became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, using his knowledge of plantation systems and escape routes to help hundreds of people reach freedom. He became a speaker too, though he faced dangers Catherine never did: the constant threat of kidnapping and re-enslavement, the violence of pro-slavery mobs, the legal persecution that targeted free black people who dared to challenge the system. He married a woman who'd escaped from Virginia, had 3 children, built a life in Boston that was shaped by freedom, but shadowed by the knowledge of what he'd survived and what so many others were still enduring. The ledgers Catherine had helped him bring north were published in excerpts in The Liberator and other abolitionist newspapers. They were cited in speeches and sermons. They were used as evidence in legal cases challenging the Fugitive Slave Act. They became part of the documentary record that abolitionists used to build their case against slavery, proof written in a slaveholder's own hand that the system was built on violence and exploitation, not paternalism and mutual benefit. Thomas Whitmore's meticulous record-keeping, meant to document his success as a planter, became instead a testament to the crimes he'd committed. Catherine never returned to South Carolina. The plantation was seized by Thomas's relatives, who sued her for theft of property and won a judgment that stripped her of any claim to the estate. She was denounced in Charleston newspapers as a traitor to her race and class, a woman who'd been corrupted by abolitionist fanaticism, a cautionary tale about the dangers of educating women beyond their proper sphere. She lived the rest of her life in modest circumstances in Boston, supporting herself by teaching and writing, never regretting the choice she'd made, but never claiming it as heroic either. "I did what I should have done years earlier," she wrote in a letter to a friend in 1863. "I don't deserve praise for finally acting on convictions I'd held in silence for too long. I deserve to be remembered as someone who was complicit in evil until the moment when complicity became impossible to sustain." Joshua lived to see the end of slavery, survived the Civil War, and died in 1889 at the age of 63. His obituary in the Boston Globe described him as a conductor on the Underground Railroad who helped hundreds reach freedom, a speaker for the abolitionist cause, and a living refutation of every lie told about the supposed inferiority of the African race. It mentioned that he stood 6 feet 9 inches tall, that he'd been born into slavery and purchased by a South Carolina planter who'd feared his intelligence, that he'd helped orchestrate the mass escape of 46 enslaved people in 1859. It didn't mention the ledgers because Joshua had never sought credit for that part of the story. He'd understood that the ledgers were more powerful as evidence than as a narrative of his own resistance, and he'd been content to let them speak for themselves. The 46 people who'd been freed from the Whitmore plantation scattered across the North. Some settled in Philadelphia, some in New York, some in Canada. They built lives as free people, working as laborers and craftsmen and domestics, raising children who'd never know slavery, creating communities that sustained them through the difficult years before and during the Civil War. A few of them wrote letters to Catherine, thanking her for what she'd done, though most understood that gratitude was complicated when it was directed at someone who'd been complicit in their enslavement for years before acting to free them. They remembered her not as a savior, but as someone who'd finally made a choice that should never have been difficult, who'd used her power to dismantle a system she'd benefited from. The story of Catherine Whitmore and Joshua raises questions that don't have easy answers. Questions about complicity and resistance, about the moral obligations of people who benefit from unjust systems, about the possibility of redemption for those who've participated in evil. Catherine spent 23 years as a slaveholder's wife, managing a household built on enslaved labor, enjoying privileges purchased with other people's suffering. Does her decision to free 46 people and help expose the crimes documented in her husband's ledgers erase those 23 years of complicity? Or does it simply demonstrate that it's never too late to start resisting, even if that resistance can't undo the harm already done? Joshua spent 23 years enslaved, watching and waiting and planning, helping people escape one or two at a time while enduring his own bondage. Does his patience make him complicit in the system that enslaved him? Or does it demonstrate the kind of strategic thinking that resistance requires when the power imbalance is so extreme that open rebellion means certain death? Is there a moral difference between Catherine's complicity as a beneficiary of slavery and Joshua's strategic accommodation as a victim of it? Or are those categories too simple to capture the complexity of how people navigate systems of oppression? These are the questions we need to sit with. The uncomfortable truths about how systems of injustice persist, not just through the actions of obvious villains, but through the complicity of ordinary people who benefit from those systems and choose comfort over resistance. Catherine Whitmore was not a hero. She was someone who participated in an evil system for decades before finally choosing to act against it. And her story is important not because it's inspiring, but because it's honest about how complicity works, about how people can know something is wrong and still participate in it, about how the decision to resist often comes late and is motivated as much by personal crisis as by moral conviction. Joshua's story is different but equally important. He was someone who survived by appearing to accommodate a system that sought to destroy his humanity, who used that appearance of accommodation to build networks of resistance, who waited for the right moment to act because premature action would have meant death without achieving anything meaningful. His story challenges the simplistic narratives we sometimes tell about resistance, the idea that moral courage always looks like open defiance, that strategic patience is the same as complicity. Joshua understood that resistance takes many forms, that survival itself can be an act of resistance when the system is designed to kill you, that waiting for the right moment is sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do. Together, their stories illustrate something crucial about how systems of oppression are challenged and eventually dismantled. It's not just through the actions of the enslaved people who resisted, though their resistance was essential. It's also through the actions of people like Catherine, who finally chose to use their privilege as a weapon against the system that granted them that privilege, who understood that their complicity had to end, even if ending it meant losing everything they'd built on the foundation of other people's suffering. The abolitionist movement needed both kinds of people: the Joshuas who'd survived slavery and could testify to its horrors from personal experience, and the Catherines who could use their identity as white Southerners to challenge the lies that defenders of slavery told about the system's benevolence. The ledgers that Joshua and Catherine brought north are preserved now in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, 4 leather-bound volumes containing thousands of entries documenting the daily operations of a South Carolina rice plantation from 1836 to 1859. Historians have used them to study the economics of slavery, the demographics of enslaved populations, the patterns of family separation and sexual violence that were endemic to the system. They've been cited in hundreds of scholarly works, featured in museum exhibitions, digitized and made available to researchers around the world. They remain one of the most detailed documentary records we have of how slavery actually functioned, written by someone who participated in and profited from the system. But the ledgers are also something else. They're evidence of what Joshua understood from the beginning, that the system's own documentation could be turned against it, that slaveholders' meticulous record-keeping was a vulnerability that could be exploited. Thomas Whitmore kept those records because he believed in the permanence of slavery, because he thought he was building a legacy that would last for generations, because he never imagined a world in which enslaved people would be free to read his words and use them as weapons. Joshua knew better. He knew that systems that seem permanent can collapse, that documentation meant to celebrate oppression can become evidence for prosecution, that the tools of the oppressor can be seized and repurposed by the oppressed. That's what made him dangerous. Not his physical strength, though he was extraordinarily strong, not his intelligence, though he was brilliant, but his refusal to accept the permanence of the system that enslaved him. He lived every day of his bondage as though freedom was inevitable, as though the system would fall and he would be there to help build something better in its place. He was right. The system did fall, though not in his lifetime and not without a war that killed 600,000 people. But it fell, and when it did, the ledgers he'd helped preserve were part of the evidence used to document its crimes, to challenge the lost cause mythology that tried to rewrite slavery as benevolent, to ensure that the truth about what had happened would be preserved for future generations. Now it's our turn to decide what we do with that truth. We live in a country that was built on slavery, that fought a war over slavery, that ended slavery but never fully addressed its legacy. We live with the consequences of that history every day, in racial wealth gaps that trace directly back to the theft of enslaved people's labor, in criminal justice systems that echo the slave patrols and black codes, in educational and residential segregation that maintains the color line slavery established. We live in a world where the descendants of enslaved people are still fighting for recognition of their humanity, still demanding that the crimes documented in ledgers like Thomas Whitmore's be acknowledged and addressed. So here are the questions I want you to sit with. What are you complicit in? What systems benefit you at the expense of others? What would it cost you to resist those systems, and are you willing to pay that cost? Catherine Whitmore waited 23 years before acting on convictions she'd held in silence. How long are you willing to wait? Joshua spent 23 years planning and preparing for a moment of resistance that might never come. What are you preparing for? What networks are you building? What documentation are you preserving that might someday be used as evidence? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're invitations to examine your own life, your own choices, your own relationship to systems of injustice, because the truth is that all of us are implicated in systems that harm people. All of us benefit from structures of inequality that we didn't create, but that we participate in every day. The question isn't whether we're complicit. We are. The question is what we're going to do about it and when we're going to start. Catherine Whitmore's story suggests that it's never too late to start resisting, but it also suggests that starting late means living with the knowledge of all the years you didn't resist, all the harm you enabled through your silence and inaction. Joshua's story suggests that resistance requires patience and strategy, but it also suggests that patience without action is just another form of complicity. Together, their stories challenge us to think carefully about what resistance looks like in our own contexts, about how we can use whatever privilege and power we have to challenge the systems that grant us that privilege and power. The 46 people who walked away from the Whitmore plantation in 1859 didn't wait for someone to free them. They'd been resisting all along, in ways large and small, maintaining their humanity in a system designed to destroy it, building communities and preserving knowledge and passing down stories that kept hope alive. Catherine and Joshua didn't free them. They helped them escape a system that had never had the right to enslave them in the first place. That distinction matters because it reminds us that freedom isn't something that's granted by the powerful to the powerless. It's something that people claim for themselves, often with the help of allies who choose to use their privilege as a weapon against the systems that granted them that privilege. So remember Catherine Whitmore, who spent 23 years complicit in slavery before finally choosing resistance. Remember Joshua, who spent 23 years enslaved but never accepted his enslavement, who waited and planned and built networks that would outlast his bondage. Remember the 46 people whose names are recorded in manumission papers preserved in the South Carolina archives, who walked away from slavery and built lives as free people. Remember the ledgers that documented crimes and became evidence for abolition. Remember that systems that seem permanent can fall, that documentation can be turned against its creators, that resistance takes many forms and all of them matter. And then decide what you're going to do with that memory, because remembering isn't enough if it doesn't lead to action, if it doesn't change how you live and what you're willing to risk and whose side you're on. The story of Catherine and Joshua and the 46 people who claimed their freedom isn't just history. It's a challenge to everyone who lives in the shadow of systems built on injustice, everyone who benefits from structures of inequality, everyone who has to decide whether they're going to be complicit or whether they're going to resist. What's your answer going to be? Now, leave a comment with one word. Remember, let's build a community of people who refuse to let these stories disappear, who understand that the past isn't past, that the choices people made in 1859 are the same choices we're making today. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge comfortable narratives and force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and then go do the work of resistance in your own life, in your own context, with whatever privilege and power you have. Because that's what Catherine and Joshua would want us to do, not to celebrate them as heroes, but to learn from their choices, both the ones they made and the ones they delayed making. Not to treat their story as inspiration, but to let it challenge us about our own complicity and our own resistance. Not to remember them as exceptional, but to understand that they were ordinary people who faced extraordinary choices and eventually chose to resist, and that we face those same choices every single day. Remember,